So we'll begin our afternoon panel. Like, do the, or, right. School social worker. Yes, if you can hear me, raise your hand, yes. Thank you. So we'll get started again with our afternoon panel, and the topic for this panel is the role of advocacy in promoting action, moving from a cause to a ballot. My name is Beth Sherman. I'm a clinical faculty here, and we were chit-chatting a little bit before with some of my panelists. We were saying, okay, here's the theory, here's the policy. Our panel, what does this look like when in the meat grinder when you're also just trying to get the work done? So, and as we try to all get the work done. So this is the practice panel, and we're excited to have our guests here this afternoon. So I'm going to do a quick introduction, and I'm going to start with Aurelia Doris, and he is a formerly convicted youth who was released in June 2015 after serving 24 years for a second-degree murder. During his time in prison, he obtained a paralegal assistance diploma, served the law library clerk, warden forum representative, and prisoner activist. The next person on our panel is Alvin Gonzalez, is the Family Division Administrator of Bering County Trial Court, Family Division in Michigan. He has oversight of all the juvenile justice programs and services in Bering County, including the Court Services Division, Intake Unit, Juvenile Detention Center with secure detention and residential treatment programs, and Youth Service Bureau diversion. And then we have Mr. Jason Smith, leads Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency's legislative advocacy efforts and serves as the coordinator of the campaign to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction in Michigan to 18. Additionally, he's responsible for managing several of MCCD's projects that aim to reduce the use of out-of-home placement through the statewide expansion of effective community-based program for justice-involved youth. So, yes. We're just honored to have you here today, all here today. So, if we could just start off with, we'll do telling the story and the work that you've been doing, and moving from gentleman to gentleman. Thank you.
First and foremost, I would like to extend my acknowledgement to the creator of the universe. Secondly, and don't take it slight being second to that, but secondly, I would like to thank you all for coming out and participating in what I know to be a much needed conversation and game plan. I would like to give honors to who I call her a warrior for the cause of making sure that we move in a direction of having humaneness and equality for everybody that's living as citizens and that's living as human beings. Mary King. I would like to give honors to the MCCD, the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency, to American Friends Service, to CAPS, to every person and every organization that has been carrying the torch to carry this message, to make the social changes to where we have some type of semblance of fairness and equality in a state and in a nation in which we live, whether they participate in a large manner or whether they participate as part of small groups or even as individuals. Each person, each entity that participates is a necessity in order to reestablish what can be called social justice. And with that being said, before I go forth, I'd like to find out who it is that I'm talking to. So, if we have anybody in here that's a part of the law or the legal field, can you raise your hand? Okay. If we have anyone in here that's a part of social work, can you raise your hand? Okay. All right. So when I speak to a group of people, I like to be a little bit interactive, call and response. And so I ask if you can repeat after me. Lights out. Quiet time. Lights out. Quiet time. Okay, we'll get back to that a little bit later. So I have a question that I would like to ask you all. If you put a 2-year-old to bed, and upon that 2-year-old waking up, you discovered that they urinated in the bed, would you whoop them with a belt or a extension cord and place them on punishment for the rest of the year? I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that everybody's answer is no. Second question, let's say you have a 14-year-old, and this 14-year-old has a summer job for the very first time, and he comes from a domestic situation that is not ideal. When it comes time to do his taxes, he doesn't have anyone inside of his house to show him how to do his taxes. And for whatever reason, he doesn't know who to ask to assist him in what he knows that has to be done. So he takes it upon himself to try to do his taxes on his own. And in doing his taxes on his own, he makes huge mistakes. He gets money back that he wasn't supposed to get back, but he didn't do it out of maliciousness. He just made a mistake because he was doing something that he didn't know. Do you think that he should be sent to a maximum security prison for the rest of his life if the amount of money that he got back violated a criminal standard? I'm going to go out again and say that your answer is probably no, right? The reason why your answer is no is because your conscience tells you that the 2-year-old mental development is not at a state to where you can implement a full degree of punishment upon them because you are considering where it is that they are at inside of their thinking. Your answer is no about the 14-year-old because you had a chance to analyze why it is that he was doing what he was doing. You knew that he was trying to do the right thing. He just didn't know how to do the right thing. And your consciousness said that's not something that he should go to prison for the rest of his life about. To give a personal introduction about myself, my name is Aurelio Jaman Doris Bey. And today, I stand here as a representative of someone who did 26 years for the Michigan Department of Corrections, 24 inside of a prison, and 2 years on parole. I stand here as a representative of not only someone who did 24 years in confinement inside of the Michigan Department of Corrections, but whose journey began when I was a juvenile at the age of 17. I stand here as a representative of a mother who unfortunately had to grow up in a situation where she saw her brother shot and killed by someone in her own family. A mother who a year later saw her father shot and killed by another person inside of her own family and never received any type of counseling, any type of help. A mother who has burns all over her body because this was the discipline that her mother gave when somebody stole a piece of food off of the stove. With no kind of counseling, with no kind of person coming along to even let her know what the trauma was that she was experiencing. And so my mother had 2 children, myself and my brother. And not being the only handbook that she had in how to raise children was the example of how she was raised herself. And since that came from a traumatic situation and circumstance, unfortunately, this is what she perpetuated because this is what she was taught was the way to raise children. So I stand here as a representative of all of the children who from age of memory, only whoopings that they remember started off with extension cords and ended up with baseball bats. I stand here as a representative of those who probably changed their grade in school, but the next day they look like the Elephant Man, can't even identify themselves inside of the mirror. As a representative of someone who is afraid every single day inside of their life, and we're talking about before they even reach the age of 12. As a representative of someone who tried to take their own life at the age of 10. You see, one of the biggest issues, the greatest issues that we have is we only address trauma from the criminal justice perspective when we deal most oftentimes with those inside of the inner city, and we do not give a comforting or a kind ear to what it is that they are going through, where it is that they are at, and what state their mental development really is. When we talk about the biology of human beings, when you suffer greater degrees of trauma, then it impedes a certain degree of maturity and development inside of your cognitive process. And so now we have someone who may be 17, but a 17-year-old that's dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and don't know what post-traumatic stress disorder is because no one can explain it. Never being diagnosed, only being sentenced when they express an illness that they are suffering from. And so one of the things that stood out to me from my incarceration was the county jail. First time I ever been arrested, and it was for a serious crime and a crime that needed to be addressed. But one thing that I remember is that when I was in the county jail, I couldn't even use the telephone for 15 months that I was in there. Going through trial for the first time, I couldn't talk to my lawyer. I didn't know how to ask for my rights. I wasn't old enough to vote. I wasn't old enough to go to a club. I wasn't old enough to smoke a cigarette. So when they sent me to prison, they sent me to an institution that didn't sell cigarettes because I was not old enough to smoke cigarettes, but I was old enough to be sentenced to 27 to 40 years in prison. My cognitive process was mature enough in order to make that type of devastating, life-changing decision, but it's not mature enough in order to decide who I want to be my city councilman. It was mature enough to get a life sentence inside of prison, but it was not mature enough in order to just go in the store and buy things that other grown people buy. When I got to quarantine, another thing that stood out. See, before I went to quarantine, I made a decision within myself that I would no longer be a victim. I actually made that decision before I ever got arrested. That's how I got arrested. I was a victim all of my life inside of my home, so I refused to be a victim when I got to the streets. When I went to prison, I refused to be a victim. Y'all remember what I asked y'all to say earlier? Let's say it one more time. Lights out. Quiet time. Lights out. Quiet time. The first time that I heard those sayings was when the CO, the correction officer, was locking us down at night. And he'll come by and he'll say, lights out, quiet time, and everybody have to get on their bunks. But the second time that I heard that is when I was taking a shower the next morning. Somebody yelled out, lights out, quiet time, and then the lights in the shower went out. It was gang shower, so you had a multitude of people in the shower at that time. And so when they yelled, lights out, quiet time, and somebody flicked the lights out, you heard a bunch of smacking, you heard a bunch of ruffling and all of that. And when the lights was turned back on, it was somebody else that was laying on the floor that had just been raped. Mindful, this was at a prison where you had to be under the age of 21 in order to be at that prison. The next time that I heard the term lights out, quiet time was later on that day inside of the bathroom. Somebody yelled, lights out, quiet time. Lights went out, heard a bunch of smacking. Somebody else was laying on the ground when the lights turned back on. Another person just been raped. And so what I decided was I'm gonna learn how to make me a knife, and the first person that looked like they want to do something to me, I'm gonna stab them. Because I learned early that violence is the way to get the results that you want to get. Violence is the way to feel safe when you paranoid because you scared. I don't know, I was looking up something, they called that post-traumatic stress disorder. They definitely didn't call it post-traumatic stress disorder in the courts when it came to sentencing people inside of the inner city. They don't diagnose that. Although it's the same elements, although it's the same symptoms, although it's the same reality as someone who goes to war in Iraq or Afghanistan or Bosnia or wherever it is that they at, and they see their comrade get killed. They hear gunshots every day. And when they come back, certain noises trigger them. Certain things set them off. I think I see people that experience that every day inside of my neighborhood. I swear every single day I heard gunshots all day where the abnormal was normalized and that became a reality, but no one identified this as a problem. Because if you begin to look at it from a mental health perspective, then you have to deal with it in ways that's other than locking somebody up for the rest of their life. You have to begin to understand what are the dynamics that's contributing to the problems and the ailments that these people are suffering. And so if you have a preponderance of people that suffering the same ailments and they commit crimes expressing the ailments that they are suffering, now you say, well, we can't send them to prison for the rest of their life. That's going to cost too much money. We got to give them doctors and all of that stuff. When a juvenile enters the courts, when anybody enters the Michigan Department of Corrections, you do not receive the help that you need if you have a long and indeterminate sentence until you get 1 year from your release date. So I went in there as a teenager and they told me, well, our test says that you need impulse control. Our test says that you need some cognitive programs. So in 22 years, when it comes time for you to get ready to go home, we'll give you those programs. It's not even rehabilitation. I didn't experience rehabilitation. What I experienced was transformative thinking. If you have bad habits to start off with and you want to reestablish or rehabilitate or revisit those same habits that you once had, the only thing that you are doing is returning to a broken idea. But if you have transformative thinking and cognitive restructuring, now you are placing new information inside of the individual, and where they once saw no love, they see the possibility of love. Where they once saw anger, where they once saw hatred, they saw that the idea of happiness, the idea of justice, the idea of fairness is something that's actually humane, and that they are entitled to as being a human being. Dostoevsky said, if you want to measure the values and the humanity of any society, all you have to do is evaluate and study how they treat their prisoners. So if we made this evaluation, if we made this study, what type of grade will we get in our values? I don't know too many countries that'll send a 10-year-old to prison for damn near the rest of their life. I don't know too many places that'll send a 15-year-old to prison for the rest of their life. When you deal with the criminal justice system, in order to be convicted of a crime, there are certain elements that must be present. One of the elements that must be present is that the perpetrator of the crime must be able to fully appreciate the weight of the consequences for what it is that he did. If he has no concept of life, if he has no concept of humaneness, if he has no concept of fairness, then how can he fully appreciate it? I asked the question, how many people in here are involved in law or the legal system? My answer is everybody is. Because it affects each and every one of us in every facet, in every aspect of our life. And as long as we see ourselves detached away from that, then we don't see ourselves having the obligation to indulge inside of that. I asked how many people were engaged in social work. Well, social work is our society and the way that our society works. And as long as you live in any society, then you are engaging in social work. Whether you are doing it from a proactive perspective or a reactive perspective, you are still engaging in it because it is impossible to escape. It is an aspect of being alive inside of a society. There's no such thing as stepping aside and letting this fight go and see how it ends up because you're neutral. There's no such thing as being neutral. We have obligations as citizens. We have obligations as human beings in order to see other human beings treated in a fair and equal fashion. It is in our best interest to get the best out of each and every individual, even those that sit languishing in prison. The greatest resource that any nation can have is its people. So you give someone a sentence. Well, they still there. They still existing. What type? We recycle our cans. We recycle our plastic. We recycle our glass. But this right here is practice. We love being green. But what about being socially green? To be socially green means you take the individuals in society that have been thrown away and you repurpose those individuals and make them a part of the collective whole so they begin to give you the answers to the problems inside of society. The people that are closest to the problem are the ones that are closest to the cure for the problem. When you have people with a 20-year sentence that has an aptitude to be able to think in certain capacities, that do not have the responsibility of driving to work, that do not have the responsibility of paying their bills. Why is it that we do not come up with some type of way in order to teach them science, to teach them biology? We would have had a cure for AIDS decades ago. We would have had cures for cancers decades ago, because we are using everything and everyone that is accessible to us. We are being socially green. And so lights out, quiet time can mean simply it's time to go to bed. It don't have to mean that somebody is getting raped. It don't have to mean that somebody else is being made a victim. But until we put forth our full effort, then it will forever mean that. Thank you.
So you are referred to as a diehard crowd. You've been here all morning. You've been here all afternoon, and you've been engaged, and we all appreciate that. I'm Elvin Gonzalez. I'm a family division administrator. That basically means I'm a juvenile court director, and I am the juvenile court director for Berrien County. If you know where the MIT, we're right here in the corner. One of the things that I learned early on in my career, I've been been involved in youth justice and juvenile justice for over 30 years. And one of the things that I learned early on in my career is that there's a few things that cause change in systems, in people, and in the way we do our work. How many of you have seen change happen as a result of lawsuits? Michigan actually had the opportunity to go through a significant experience with that when children's rights lawsuit with the child welfare system. How many of you seen change happen as a result of media investigation? Media shines a light in the corners, in the darkness, where the forgotten live, where the invisible live. How many of you seen change happen as a result of scandal? Corruption gets exposed. All of a sudden, we need to fix this. How many of you seen change happen as a result of leaders who just decide to ask the right questions and decide to say, you know what? Instead of saying, why can't we? They start asking, what if we do things differently? How many of you see change happen as a result of politics? Just a few of you, okay. That's good. Well, it's interesting because in the juvenile justice system, we've heard a lot today. I think that the presenters that have come before us have done an excellent job laying what I call the foundation of knowledge. They've given you the macro, the conceptual, the macro, the theoretical. I'm a practitioner. And so I'm going to give you the micro. What is it like on the ground to change a juvenile justice system? Before coming to work in Michigan, I worked for 16 years outside of Chicago. I worked in Chicago working with kids that were involved in gangs. And what I learned real quickly is a thing called replacement theory. So when I was talking to this young man who was involved in a gang, and this is back when I was naive and had a full head of hair, I said to the guy, well, just being very naive right out of school, why don't you just leave the gang, get out of the gang? And he looked at me with very wise 14-year-old eyes, and he says, you don't understand replacement theory. And I said, what do you mean replacement theory? What does that mean? He says, well, I'll tell you what that means. Replacement theory means if you take something from me and you give me nothing to replace it, you've given me nothing. So I go back to what I know. If you tell me don't be involved in criminal conduct, don't hang around with gang friends, but give me nothing to replace it, I will go back to what I know. If you're going to take something from me, you have to give something that builds me up. You have to replace it. This is a young man that I met when he was escorting, as vice president of his gang. His job was to escort a young man that had been court-ordered to come to this agency for counseling services. So as I peered out of the window of this youth service agency and I saw these two young men get off the bus, one was dressed rather uniquely. He had very specific colors he was wearing. This was in Humboldt Park. How many of you know where Humboldt Park is? West side of Chicago, right? He came across the street with his escort, and the young man that was court-ordered to come for counseling came upstairs, and I said, who's the guy with you? He says, oh, just a friend. I said, you have a very interestingly dressed friend. He's wearing pink and black. What's up with that? So I was curious, and so I went downstairs and I began to engage this young man and talk to him and find out what he was all about. And he said, eventually I learned he was vice president of this gang, and his job was to escort this young man across gang lines on the bus to come to this agency for counseling services. I struck up a conversation with this young man, and he's the one who taught me about replacement theory. One of the things that I've learned also early on is that as adults, we tend to view kids in generalities. We tend to view crime, and especially juveniles, in generalities. When I worked in Chicago, I had the opportunity to work with the DuPage County Probation Department, which is a western suburb of Chicago, and I worked there for 16 years, and I became the director there. And working in that court, we were at the beginning cusp of the change that was begin to soon sweep the nation about really being critical and examining the work that we were doing with kids and youthful offenders. And we began to ask ourselves some questions. Are we satisfied with the results that we're getting? Are we satisfied with the outcomes we're getting? In fact, this might come as a surprise to you, but many juvenile justice system probation departments do not track outcomes. They do not measure outcomes. My phone burned off the hook when I first came here to Michigan because I was getting all these calls from residential placements here in Michigan who were marketing themselves for me to place juvenile offenders in their facilities. So I'd ask them two questions. How do you know if what you do works? And what data do you have that proves that to me? Because you have very nice marketing brochures. You have a very good admissions coordinator. They're very friendly. They give me nice pens. They show up in my office and have these nice, beautiful, market-produced brochures. But how do you know what works? And how do I know that this works? So let me give you a context. I arrive in Berrien County. We have about 125 kids in out-of-county, out-of-state residential placement. The average length of stay is 15 months, and the average per diem is about $175 a day for one kid. So we are spending millions of dollars sending kids off to facilities. We're also spending millions of dollars disrupting these kids' natural support systems. Because guess what? Those residential facilities, they're not 5 miles away from the courthouse. They're 50, 500 miles in some cases away from the courthouse. So these kids are not seeing their families. The other thing that we're doing, we're spending this money putting these kids in placements, and when we began to do retroactive research on what happened to these kids, there was a high recidivism rate for these residential placements. So I would go to these residential placements and meet with their CEOs and their CFOs and all their executive folks, and I'd say, well, you know, we've sent X number of kids here, and this percentage of kids have reoffended. And this is, quote, the comment I would get from residential placements. Well, you know, we're in the human services business, and we really can't be responsible for choices people make, and you know, we can't guarantee our results, and you know, we can say what they do while they're here, but we can't guarantee anything after that. Well, that was a pretty alarming statement, because I've just paid this placement $80,000, for example, to place a kid there, and you can't give me any assurances that what you're doing works or that it's going to have any sustained positive benefit. When I worked working in Berrien County, we had a juvenile detention center. My very first 30 days on the job, I go to meet with all the chiefs of police, and I probably should have worn a bulletproof vest. I got dirty looks, dirty comments. They were completely disgusted with the juvenile detention facility because we were running an overcrowded detention facility, 17 years of chronic overcrowding. We had 16 beds of secure detention. The highest population we had in those 16 beds was 35 kids in 16 beds. Guess what other things occurred in that detention center when overcrowding? Increase in suicide attempts by juveniles in that facility. Resident on resident, youth on youth assaults. Youth on adult assaults. AWOL attempts. It was a mess. So when I did my interview with the judge panel that interviewed me, they said, we want you to do two things. We want you to stop this bleeding expenditure we have from a budgetary perspective, and we need you to do something to change our placement patterns and what's going on in our juvenile detention facility. It was a pretty tall order. It was mentioned earlier in the earlier presentation that there are some very specific strategies that you can do to change, improve, enhance, be more effective in the juvenile justice system. Guess what? Those things work. As I stand here before you today, we have 36 kids in out-of-home residential placement, down from 125. We have not exceeded our rated capacity in our detention center for more than 5 days at any time in the last 10 years. We have developed a continuum of evidence-based programs and implemented a continuum of evidence-based programs that keep kids in their community, work with them and their families, their parents, and show better outcomes in terms of long-term outcomes, a year to 15 to 24 months post-closure, than any residential placement that we use. The average cost of providing that treatment service to one family, a youth and their family, is about $8,000. Where the cost of placing a youth in a residential program can be anywhere about $6,000 a month on average. What I did is I went to my board of commissioners and I said, look, we're going to demonstrate that by changing the way we do these services, we're going to take the savings from not placing so many kids under this condition. I want you to allow me to reinvest those savings to expand and enhance the community-based programs that are in the community. And you're going to see three things happen. We're going to have better sustained outcomes. It's going to be less expensive. And those kids will not have the recidivism rates. They'll have lower recidivism rates than the kids we send off to residential placement. So here's the good news story. Over 80% of the kids, actually 83% of the kids we work with on juvenile probation do not reoffend 1 year post-closure. 82% of the kids that are in these home-based programs stay living with their families. They don't go to jail, prison, or residential programs. Over 3/4 of those kids stay in school or some form of educational program, as opposed to what happens when you're 17 and you go to jail, you don't get educational programs of any real substance. There was a question asked earlier, what percentage of the kids that we work with in our juvenile justice system have special education needs or issues? In Berrien County, 32% of the kids in the juvenile justice system have a diagnosed special education eligibility. 32%. Primarily emotionally impaired and learning disabilities. Here's another thing we want I want you to consider. We've heard strong evidence here today about what I call the myths about reforming the juvenile justice or the adult justice system. The myth that it will create more criminals, that it will flood our jails, that it won't work. And we've seen state after state after state bust those myths. It's interesting to me, as I mentioned in my earlier comment when I had an opportunity to ask the question, that the prosecutors believe that they are enhancing public safety by focusing on convictions, and they forget the fact that they should be about creating less victims in the community. And they should do that in partnership with juvenile justice. They should do that in partnership with educators. They should do that in partnership with therapists. If in reality what happens is that prosecutors, by their practices, transfer kids to adult court, punish them by putting them in jails and prisons, they are basically creating additional victims. Because we know what the numbers are about recidivating. If you're a juvenile and you go to prison, you're high risk to reoffend when you get out. As was mentioned earlier, you reoffend earlier, you reoffend more seriously, and you reoffend more often when you do that. So how do you convince judges and prosecutors to think differently about this? One of the ways we did this was by bringing in other folks. One of the things I've learned about judges, they like to hear from other judges. One of the things I know about prosecutors, they like to hear from other prosecutors. They naturally have a skepticism if you're a helping professional and you're trying to convince them to change their prosecution practices. But they will listen to other prosecutors who've come around and have seen the change. Another thing we need to do, and this is an area where the juvenile justice system is not as progressed and as far along as I believe we need to be, we need to collect data longitudinally with standardized definitions, standardized variables, so we can measure what we do to prove that it works. We can all think of stories where we've heard the most worst case scenario, the juvenile case that actually changed public policy. We heard an example of it here earlier. One case changed public policy in a state because it was the worst case scenario. If you think about that, how has juvenile justice and the criminal justice system evolved over the years? It's not evolved based on science, research, study. It's been reactive. It's been punitive. It's the belief that if you punish them harder, that'll teach them. And what types of consequences has we as a community received? Well, we received very expensive facilities, the highest incarceration rate in the country, one of the highest recidivism rates in the country, and we've really diverted services from the front end. Somebody mentioned about prevention, early intervention. Guess what? That works as well. We divert over nearly 50% of all cases referred to juvenile court in our county. And when we began to expand our diversion services, one of the things that we were being told, well, if you divert all these kids away, they're going to go out and just commit crimes. Guess what? That's not true. We track those kids 12 months after we close their case. 93% of those kids do not reoffend 1 year after we divert them. 93%. So it was touched on briefly. How many of you have heard the term collateral consequences? Collateral consequences are the negative, cascading ripple effects of what happens when you as a juvenile end up with a record, an adjudication or a conviction if you get moved to the adult court. Think of cascading negative consequences, things like this. You end up with a conviction that's very hard and sometimes impossible to get off your record, which follows you for the rest of your life. That record can be potentially, and frequently, is publicly available to prospective employers, schools, banks, apartments, if you want to rent an apartment, if you want to get a loan. We've had kids call us and say, I tried to get into school and they denied me because I had a shoplifting charge on my record at 14 and they found it. Those are collateral consequences. One of the things that we know about diversion, if you complete a diversion program, that record is sealed. It's a non-public record. That's not going to follow you for the rest of your life. Another thing we need to be very mindful of is that when we are working with children in the juvenile justice system, we have to differentiate between the children we're working with. Not all of the children in the juvenile justice system are high-risk offenders, high risk to recidivate. In fact, the research is pretty clear about this. Anywhere between 20 to 25, max 30% are high risk to reoffend, about 60% are moderate risk to reoffend, and the balance are low risk to reoffend. Guess what we had been doing historically with offenders? We've kind of one size fits all. Everybody gets the same kind of punishment, series of sanctions, and what it's actually done is made kids that would have been very likely to desist get further involved in the juvenile justice system. When we compare the two systems, the adult justice system and the juvenile justice system, here's some stark contrast. When you go to jail as a juvenile, you have higher incident rates of suicide attempts. In fact, 6 times higher rates of suicide attempts. You spend disproportionate amounts of time in isolation. They will call it protective segregation, administrative segregation, all these nice words. But basically, it's solitary confinement. And the research evidence on the negative effects of being in solitary confinement are comparable to what happens when you use prisoner of war tactics. You remove all stimulation, you remove all interaction, you remove all sense of self, and actually juveniles who find themselves spending high amounts of time in jails or in prison start to disassociate. They start to have significant mental health complications when they are in those settings. Here's what we know about what happens to young ladies who come into the system and go off to correctional facilities. About 60% of the girls involved in the juvenile justice system have documented histories of sexual victimization, physical abuse, sexual abuse. 60%. You mentioned trauma. You're all familiar with the ACEs study, correct? Adverse childhood experiences. Just Google adverse childhood experiences. What they've shown is that as a person accumulates or experiences adverse childhood experiences, that has direct correlation to their outcomes as an adult, negatively. So one of the things we began to do is to take a look at how we can become a trauma-informed court, educating our staff, prosecutors, attorneys, treatment folks about trauma, ramping up diversion, using risk needs assessment instruments, collecting outcome data, and then reporting that outcome data back to our funders. It's very interesting what happens when you go to meet with your board of commissioners and you can say, here are the programs that we've implemented, here are the number of youth that have gone through those programs, and here's the longitudinal results of those programs. We would like more money, please. They actually give it to you, especially if what you show them works. The other thing that you can do is say, we've looked at this data, this doesn't work, we're not going to do this anymore. You really can do that. To give you a quick example, when I had these conversations with residential placements, I said to them, I want you to enter into a warranty of services agreement with our court. And they looked at me and said, what does that mean? That means if I place a youth in your facility, and you've had a chance to screen that youth and evaluate whether they're appropriate, and they're there in your facility, you will warranty your service, and you will agree that if they should reoffend during a designated period of time post-release, you will take them back on your dollar. And you will provide free treatment up for that kid and family for whatever period of time we agree in order to address those issues. Many residential facilities said they couldn't do that. And I said, I respect your right to decline that, and you need to respect my right to not use you. 10 years ago, we had 1 residential facility that was willing to do that. Today, we have 15 that do that with us. Now, let me share some quick information with you about the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. We heard a lot this morning about the young children that are in jails and prisons that are 17 and older, or went there at age 17. Here's the open secret. The majority of 17-year-olds that are involved in the criminal justice system are living in our communities. They're on probation in our communities. In fact, over probably 90% of the 17-year-olds that have been convicted as adults are convicted for misdemeanor offenses. Did you hear what I said? 90% approximately are convicted for misdemeanor offenses. What would you guess those misdemeanor offenses would be? Did somebody say drugs? Yes. Possession of marijuana, possession of alcohol. That's the most common offense they're convicted of. Second most common offense, retail fraud or theft-related offenses. Retail fraud is shoplifting. The third most common offense is assault and battery, misdemeanor level assault and battery, so no great bodily injury to the victim. Might be a little bit of DV mixed in there, but those are the three most common offenses that 17-year-olds are involved in adult court, placed on probation for, and have convictions for. Here's something else you might find interesting. What percentage of those 17-year-olds with those charge backgrounds do you think have prior criminal history? We looked at that data in our county. 70% of those kids have no prior juvenile record. 70%. What that tells us is these are first-time offenders in the adult system, ending up with convictions, with all the negative collateral consequences, not being diverted away from the adult system, when in juvenile court, that's one of our expertise. We're really good about knowing how to divert those young people away from formal adjudication, formal conviction. So when people say to you, well, you know, if you move, you raise the age, and you have these 17-year-olds handled in juvenile court, you're going to flood the juvenile court, and you're going to fill your juvenile detention centers, the data and the evidence does not bear that out. It does not. The other thing we realize is that of these 17-year-olds, I mentioned there's about 90% of them are involved for misdemeanor offenses, so that leaves 10%. Those are 10% of the juveniles or these 17-year-olds that are charged with felonies. A portion of those folks are on felony parole, with adult parole. But we're talking a very small number of offenses. In fact, the Raise the Age initiative has not taken the option away from being able to transfer a juvenile who commits a very serious crime to adult court. We're familiar with the concept of the waiver process, correct? As far as I understand, there's no discussion about removing the waiver option from a juvenile court judge. That's still available in those circumstances where we have a very heinous crime committed by a 17-year-old. So I would pose to you, based on everything that we've heard today, that not only is this possible, this is very doable. I had an individual that worked with my staff, and her comment to me was the cause and the cure are found in the community of these issues that we struggle with. I mentioned one thing that causes change in systems. Did I mention budget? Do you remember when this conversation about Raise the Age started? What was going on in Michigan at the time? Some significant budget challenges, right? Department of Corrections budget was ballooning. We had high numbers of people in incarceration. In fact, I think when I checked this morning, the number of people that are currently in prison in Michigan is about equivalent to the student enrollment here at University of Michigan. What's your enrollment here at University of Michigan? 44,000? There's a little bit over that currently in prison. So it'd be like taking the entire student enrollment population of the University of Michigan and putting them in prison. How much does it cost to put a person in prison for 1 year? Anybody know? Between 34 and depending what kind of facility you're in, it can go up to about $40,000 to put one person in prison for a year. What's tuition here at University of Michigan for a year? What's that? About 17,000. Okay. So here we are. We're spending between 35 and 40,000 to incarcerate one person for a year. We're getting about 63% of those folks reoffending when they get released, and about half of those folks are going back to prison. So imagine, I mentioned this to one of our presenters during the break, if I had a business where I sold a product, say it was cars, and you bought the car from me, and 63% of the time that you bought that, of people that bought that car, the car broke down. And it wasn't any good, it just broke down. Would I still be in business as a business? You would not be sending people to Gonzales, Cars R Us. You would probably not. But yet we've had this kind of skewed belief that by putting people in prisons that aren't effective in rehabilitating folks, that somehow is making our community safer, when in fact we know it's actually resulting in additional victims in our community. So here's the good news. We can do this differently. We can do this better. We can do this more cost effectively. And at the end of the day, we can even do this in a way that makes a positive difference in the lives of the young people that we work with and their families. And we don't have to marginalize them. We don't have to put them in boxes, in cages, in cells. It's actually better for their mental health. And at the end of the day, it's better for us as a community, because we're a safer community as a result of these changes. So one of the things we're going to have to do as a community is decide, how do you take what you've learned today and move it to the next step of action? Who do you need to be talking to today or this weekend? Who do you need to send an email to and say, I want to have a conversation, legislators. I want to have a conversation, prosecutors. I want to have a conversation, judges, about this Raise the Age initiative. Let's move this conversation forward. One of the things that, when I look back on my career, and as I look into the future, I know that the changes that my team and I have made in our county, I may not reap all the positive benefits of, because we're working with kids that are, the youngest kid we're working with, by the way, is a 10-year-old. And those kids in 10 years from now will be 20. What I do know is we've changed the trajectory of those kids. We've given them a chance to have a different outcome than they would have otherwise had. And one of the things my dad was very keen on instilling in me was the idea is, when you look back on your life and you look at your wake, think of a boat analogy, what impact did you have? Not on yourself, but on others and those around you. Did you make it better? Did you leave it better? Did you make it better for others? And I think there's a way to do this that has all those positive benefits, smart on justice, better for kids. And so I hope that you are inspired by your being here today. I hope that you are more than inspired, that you're moved to action, to at least engage in additional conversations with folks that need to be hearing this message. And that you can be part, as was mentioned, of really transforming Michigan and having a more effective, a smarter, and more beneficial justice system. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to bring it home. So I'm Jason Smith, and I work for the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. My title is Youth Justice Policy Associate. I'm an advocate. I have been asked to talk about the advocacy process in relation to Raise the Age and how we started and how we got to the point of where we are with the current legislation, and what you all can do to make sure that we pass this legislation into law. I am the campaign coordinator, but I don't view myself as a leader. It's a partnership that includes everyone from Michigan, and I view you all as partners in this campaign too. It's going to take all of us working together, acknowledging that this is the right thing to do, talking to each other, talking about how we can make this a success, to make sure that it comes to fruition. So when we first, MCCD, became interested in working on this issue, it was really building off the national movement to remove youth from adult facilities in the adult justice system. We worked on a report in 2014. It's called Youth Behind Bars. You can see it on our website. Don't want to plug it too hard. But it incorporates a lot of the information that we learned today, a lot of the national research, touches upon the brain science. We interviewed experts from across the country and here in Michigan, pulled data from the Michigan Department of Corrections, and looked at the number of youth who were placed in adult facilities and in the adult criminal justice system, focusing exclusively on the Michigan Department of Corrections, because that was the data we had. So for felony cases, not necessarily the misdemeanor district courts. And we saw that from 2003 to 2013, there were over 20,000 youth who were convicted as adults under the age of 18. And 95% of them were just because they were 17. And so we are advocating to remove all youth from adult facilities and jails, prisons and jails under the age of 18. But by raising the age from 17 to 18 of juvenile jurisdiction, you would be touching the majority of them. You would be addressing the majority and removing most of the youth from the adult facilities. So research is the first step of advocacy. I wanted to talk about the key components to the advocacy process and how you move from the beginning to moving legislation into law. You have to know the facts. We knew personally, and from the information that we've heard at other conferences and other events and things that you've heard today, that the justice system, the adult system, is not the place to serve young people, and that there's harmful consequences for it. But to go out and advocate with legislators, with the general public, to inform them on this issue, you have to know the facts. So we created that report. After it was complete, we, in 2014, 2015, we took it on the road, did a road show. And we presented at as many community events, churches, stakeholder groups. Anyone who asked us to come and talk about this issue, we were willing to get there. Normally, we would bring a stack of reports with us, but it's just gone because we've given them out at every event that we've been to. And one thing that we learned from presenting on this issue is that the general public, a lot of them didn't even know that 17-year-olds were automatically prosecuted as adults. In the report and in the fact sheets that are included in those folders, we show or highlight some of the other laws that consider anyone under the age of 18 as a youth and they're prohibited from participating in. And most people thought that the same thing applied to the criminal justice system. If you're 17, you're considered a youth, and your parent could be charged with abuse and neglect if you live in some sort of harmful environment. Yet, if you're arrested and you're 17, your parent has no right to know what's going on with your situation. They don't have any input in your treatment, or any input in what happens during sentencing. That was a shock to a lot of people. And I remember Mark, during his presentation, talked about public opinion polling. And here in Michigan, there was a poll released around the time that our report was released that showed that, in general, the citizens of Michigan do believe that 18-year-old youth under the age of 18 do not belong in adult facilities and jails. So matching with the reality with what people's opinions were, it was an important thing. Bringing this to system stakeholders as well, this general report of what's happening to Michigan's youth was important too. I think that often justice system stakeholders, both juvenile court folks and the adult system, exist in silos. They may do well in their communities. They may have great programs, but they don't understand in the greater sense, statewide, what impact things have when, as a collective, we send youth to the adult system. So we did a lot of community events. We worked on recruiting people to become supporters of our campaign and to be actual campaign partners, which is important. When you do outreach and coalition, you need to figure out who can help you. We can't, as an advocate, I can only do so much. I don't have the ability to share a story or an experience like Aurelio can. I'm not a system stakeholder who believes in the right thing to do, like Judge Szymanski or Elvin. They have an ability to reach people that I cannot, same as you all can as social workers. You work with these kids every day. You work often in systems that still consider 17-year-olds children, and you can attest to their need to be in environments that are youth-focused. You can attest to the need that their parents are involved in their treatment. You can attest to the need that they are still existing in a family unit and that their family needs to be involved for them to be successful. So our goal of sharing this information in a way that the general public can grasp and quickly understand and share with others is, the goal of that is to bring people on board so that it is a collective fight. It's a collective effort to make that change. Number 3 is communication and media and messaging, targeting specific groups and audiences for messaging and convincing them that this is the right thing to do. When we talk about raise the age and moving 17-year-olds to the juvenile justice system, there are some baseline truths that doesn't shift no matter who you're talking to. 1 is this is the right thing to do. 2 is that juveniles, 17-year-olds, when they're served in the JJ system, as you've heard all day, they have better outcomes than they do in the adult system. And then 3, even if there is an initial cost, long-term there is savings both for the state and local communities by reducing recidivism, allowing folks to not be saddled by an adult criminal conviction before they become adults, and having the ability to earn an income and become successful, productive adults, and then also reducing the amount of future crime victims and the costs associated with them. Rather than viewing this as an extreme cost, states that have been successful in passing this legislation have moved the message that this was actually an investment made. An investment made in their communities, an investment made in kids. And so those are the baseline truths. Now, when you send messages to stakeholders, depending on who they are, where they are across the state, that might vary a little bit. There are people who it really resonates with them on this issue that it's a cost-cutting measure, that if you really want to cut the $2 billion budget of the Department of Corrections, stop youth from coming in the front door. There are other people who view this as a moral issue, other folks who view this as a civil rights issue, that you're infringing on the parental rights for not being involved in their youth's care and well-being. And then there are other people in the business community that you see this as a talent issue. Michigan is a state that has an aging workforce, a shrinking workforce. Why are we saddling 17-year-olds when we're struggling for youth talent with a criminal record that's going to impede them from furthering their education and securing a career that will sustain them and a family ongoing? It's a competitive issue. All the states around us in the Midwest, their juvenile jurisdiction is at 18. We're the lone person in that group, the lone state in that group. When we launched our campaign in 2015, we, on our website, and it's still there, on raisedagemi.org, there's a statement of principles that outlines a list of principles, basically, that if you agree with, you're saying that it's best to treat youth in the juvenile justice system, that they get better services there, all the things that I've outlined earlier and that you heard earlier today. To date, we've had about 600 individuals and organizations sign that statement of principles. On the website, you can see the logos of many of the organizations that supported our campaign and believe in this. Many of them are service providers that serve youth in the juvenile justice system, have stated that they're ready to take these kids on should the legislation pass. And we hope that everyone who signed that and continue to stay active even during this long slog while we try to pass the legislation. Because when we wrote the Youth Behind Bars report, there were still 11 states that charged 17-year-olds as adults, many of them who charge 16-year-olds as adults. And now we're down to 5. So not only can we do this, and is it possible, it's inevitable. And if you get some of the stakeholders who may be on the fence or in opposition alone, they'll even tell you that they believe that's inevitable. I mean, there are things that folks want to see happen, you know, and to make it work successfully, but they know that this is coming. And so we have to keep people's feet to the fire and make sure that they're doing the work to make sure that it happens. We were really successful in the last session, 2015-2016 legislative session, in getting this word out beyond just our community events, but to the media and to people at large through social media and massive communications. Judge Szymanski actually wrote an op-ed in the Detroit Free Press supporting Raise the Age last session. There was a documentary, a 30-minute documentary created by Al Jazeera, the Al Jazeera channel, highlighting this issue of youth in the adult system, specifically in Michigan. The producers came here and actually includes video footage of some of the youth being assaulted in the adult facilities. Some of the examples that Deb LaBelle talked about earlier. And we showed that at events, showed people exactly what are happening to youth when they're put in adult facilities, and that really resonated with people. And we're hoping to, I'll talk about it in a minute, but we're having events that we're planning to continue to show that documentary. We also, MCCD and our partners on the Raise the Age campaign developed an advocacy toolkit that has a lot of our talking points on why the law needs to be changed, has examples of templates for letters to the editor, letters to your legislators, op-eds that folks can use and submit on their own in their own letterhead or their own name to advance the agenda. The fourth is lobbying, finding legislative champions to support Raise the Age. We were lucky that in December, I think it was December of 14, we were doing a Youth Behind Bars event, presenting the findings of our report, and one of the representatives from that district, his name is Harvey Santana, a Democrat from Detroit, was in the audience and came up to us and said that he wanted to do something on this issue, wanted to put together a legislative work group, and so he said, give us your Christmas list of issues you'd like to see turned into legislation. And so we essentially, it wasn't complete, but we essentially gave him the recommendations from Youth Behind Bars, which were to raise the age from 17 to 18, remove all youth under the age of 18 from adult facilities and prisons and jails, limit and reduce solitary confinement of young people, and for kids that are still waived or enter the adult system under the age of 18, track them better. Get better data on where they were when they entered the system and where they left. I mean, where they are when they leave. Because as you heard someone earlier say, when kids are released after being in prison for a long period of time, reentry looks different from them than someone who entered the prison system when they were an adult. These are folks that never learned how to sign a check, never owned a home or rented a home, owned a car, things like that, probably never had a job. And so what the life skills that they need, the reentry services they need, are going to probably look vastly different than someone who entered the system as a 30-year-old. So after we gave that legislation to the representative, he chaired a legislative work group that brought a lot of the stakeholders together that are interested in this issue. So people representing the state, people representing the counties, various stakeholder groups, the juvenile courts, the district courts, the prosecutors, the sheriffs. We brought them all together to look at the language of the bills, to think about, to give their input, and think about ways that they could be amended if needed to satisfy their concerns to pass the legislation. At the time, people did give suggestions that did amend things, but the one thing that could not be solved during that work group was the issue of costs. Like you've heard Mark say and other presenters say throughout the day, that has been the bugaboo for every state that has tried to raise the age. And here, when the bills were finally introduced and there was a hearing on the legislation, there was a fiscal analysis, there was a fiscal impact statement done by the House Fiscal Agency. The legislation initiated in the House and was introduced into the House Criminal Justice Committee. Folks being the stakeholder groups, felt that the House fiscal impact statement wasn't completely valid and didn't really support universally the results of it. Felt like it wasn't adequate in saying what the costs were. Some people said it was too high, some people said it was too low. That didn't stop the legislation from moving. They passed out of the House with a huge margin, 95%, overwhelmingly, all of the bills. And the majority of the bills were what you see in your folder, that legislative overview. Once the bills got to the Senate, that's where the things stalled last session. They stalled because many of the stakeholders that were concerned about cost shared those concerns with the Senate and said that we needed to wait until there was an independent study completed, and that's kind of where we are right now. So there's an independent study that's been commissioned by the legislature to look at what the cost would be for moving 17-year-olds down to the JJ system, what the savings would be to the state, and then what the potential savings would be to the counties as well. Because remember, district courts are county-based. And those, there would be a cost savings for them for not having to serve 17-year-olds. And additionally, what the cost would be for jails to not have to be able to comply with PREA if you removed all youth under the age of 18 from those jails. That study is currently underway. It's not due back until January 31st is the deadline, but what I'm hearing is that the researchers think that it'll be done before then. So that's really defined our timeline as a campaign. We knew that the legislators probably weren't going to take up a vote on the legislation until the study was complete and that there was a cost estimate returned. So while we wait for that study to be complete, we've focused on outreach and engagement again. At the beginning of the session, I met with the legislators that are still around. Some of them were term limited at the end of 2016. But those who were there, and the majority were still there, were very interested in reintroducing their bills. They wanted to do the House vote right away. And I said, you know, perhaps we should hold on a little bit to try to engage some of the other stakeholder groups now that we have a bit of time to let them voice some of their issues or their concerns. There was a little bit of, we got feedback from some stakeholder groups that they didn't have adequate time to voice some of their concerns with the issues, and they felt a bit rushed last time. So now that we have this ability to wait while the study's being completed, let's re-engage people and see exactly where they are on this issue, see if there's been any movement, if they've had any clarity on what specifically are their concerns. If the concern is its cost and it's too expensive, what about it is too expensive? What do you need to, what would that money, if you had all the money in the world, what would that be used for to successfully implement Raise the Age? So one of the things we did, and Elvin actually participated in it, MCCD did statewide focus groups with juvenile court administrators by region, invited as many as we could. We had the juvenile courts actually host the meetings and then invite their colleagues so that we can actually discuss this. Not the debate on whether or not Raise the Age is right, but what do you need, what kind of barriers do you think you have, and what would you need to be able to successfully implement it? And the results varied. Like Joe said earlier, there's 83 counties. Each county has their own juvenile court. Some share juvenile courts. But their needs are very different. Urban areas have different needs than very rural counties that lack resources and services. And so giving people that opportunity to voice that concern allows them to feel like they're having a stake in the game and that they're a partner in finding a solution too. And I really think that was beneficial. We started in June, ended up in August, and did about 6 of those. As north as Grand Traverse, and we didn't go to the UP, but we had them on the phone. So right now, that's where we are. We're waiting for the legislation, the study to be complete, and we're pushing the legislators that are bill sponsors to stay on board while we're waiting for the results and be ready to have a hearing once the study is complete. Because no matter what the cost says, we know this is the right thing to do, right? We know that this is an issue, the money's there. Yes, you know, every state goes through financial constraints and budget concerns, but we need to lift this issue as a priority to the level of the roads or tax cuts or whatever else is the priority of the legislature or the state of the day. So I want to make sure that I'm staying on time, so I'm kind of rushing through, excuse me. I wanted to talk about ways that you all can get involved in this campaign, those who are interested in it. Number one is to host an event, a Raise the Age related event. October is Youth Justice Awareness Month. It's National Youth Justice Awareness Month, but here in Michigan, we do events related to youth in the adult system every year. Every year that he's been in office, Governor Snyder has signed a proclamation acknowledging that it's Michigan Youth Justice Awareness Month. He already did so for this year. The proclamation is on the website, the Raise the Age website, so you can see it yourself. We're hoping to host 4 to 5 events in October. We already have a couple of scheduled. One is in Lansing, Grand Rapids, Detroit, and Ottawa County in Holland. And then there's a group of folks, a couple people I talked to today and yesterday that are interested in hosting one in Ann Arbor. So maybe even 2. So as soon as we find out more and get those groups together and organized, we'll make sure that everyone is aware of that. 2 is share your story. Like Aurelio, actually having people that have been impacted by the current practice, people who were incarcerated at 17 or just placed on probation, because the services you get as a youth on probation in the adult system is vastly different than what JJ kids get. The partnerships with other youth-focused service organizations, child welfare, mental health, they all consider 17-year-olds children. When you are convicted as an adult, when 17 and you're put on community probation, the probation officers, their participation in wraparound and things like that ends. Their partnerships with the schools, if the kid, when we were talking about juniors and seniors in high schools, relatively ends. We need people to share those stories as well. The issue of incarceration, the harmful consequences of that is important, and that needs to be highlighted and is very serious, but people need to understand that the majority of the youth that are convicted as adults are harmfully impacted as well. So we ask that you be willing to share your story, and there's an link on that Raise the Age website that says Take Action that will take you to a place where you can be contacted or you can contact someone to share your story or actually post it yourself. Write letters to the editor of newspapers. I recently saw a student who wrote a letter supporting Raise the Age in the Lansing State Journal. A young person saying that she had many friends that their lives had turned out dramatically different because they were given a criminal record at the age of 17. That's still powerful. People still read newspapers. And then the final thing I would say, and there's many more actions you can do, is it's never not it's always important to contact your state and local legislators. That bill overview tells you what representatives are sponsoring legislation. If that's one of your representatives, you can thank them for their support and encourage them to keep moving forward on this issue. Everyone has a representative and a senator. I would suggest you contact them both. If your legislator is not in support or not a bill sponsor, I would contact them and tell them that this is something that's important to you. This is something that you want to see passed and encourage them to do that. I would also, when I say local legislators, I'm talking about county commissioners. One of the things that folks have continually asked after every presentation is like, why are we kind of stuck in the mud, you know? And it's truly a funding issue. It's down to the money. Every person, like I said, who will say that this is eventually inevitable has also said that they agree in concept. Prosecutors, as an association, maybe the individual prosecutors may not say this, but judges, the counties and the juvenile courts will say we agree philosophically that 17-year-olds are kids and they need to be treated in the juvenile justice system. The county commissioners are looking at the budget over a moral issue, and they think that they're doing this on your behalf, that you want them to maintain good finances, and so anything that could be at a potential cost to them, they're going to push against. You need to show them that you honestly believe that this is an investment and that you're not doing this in their behalf if they continue to fight this issue. Yeah, that's all that I have.
So thank you very much. Aurelio, Alvin, and Jason. Awesome. Very nice. Great way to end this in terms of the hands-on. This is always what we want to do, is try to get a sense of where do we go from here. And we have some great ideas. I mean, what we'll do, and Joe, what we should do is put the website on our website, you know, and we'll have information, the resources that we got. We'll try to get up the PowerPoints and all. But on behalf of the Fauri family, of course, Dean Videka, the Planning Committee, Joe Ryan, myself, Robert Ortega, Emeriti Rosemary Sari, Beth Sherman, and Shannon Cook. Also, the Office of Student Services, Michigan Law for allowing us to squat here all day, and to you as participants who are interested in this very important issue. And our guest speakers, you know, everybody here offered so much to take away. We had originally thought we would have some time to talk and all, but I want to honor the 4 o'clock time. If there is anything burning, we might have like 1 second, a couple seconds to answer questions from the panelists here.
Adverse childhood experiences. ACE study.
Right. Anything else? Going once? Going twice? Have a great weekend. Thank you. Thank you all.